Good evening. Welcome to the Harn Museum of Art. My name is Eric Siegel, Education Curator of Academic Programs, and I get to welcome you on behalf of Rebecca Nagy, the Director of the museum, who's unable to be here this evening. It's our pleasure, and slightly sad pleasure, because this is the last lecture we get to host. It's our pleasure to host the last lecture of the HESCA series of lectures this year, the Harn Eminent Scholar Chair in Art History. The Harn Eminent Scholar Chair in Art History was established with an endowment by Dr. David A. and Marianne Coffrin, wonderful supporters of the museum. This particular endowment supports intellectual exchange and activity between the School of Art and Art History, between the Art History program in particular, and the museum. And it gives us wonderful opportunities to bring eminent scholars in art history, art critics, and curators, museum directors, and as well as anthropologists, as it turns out, who are thinking about art history and the visual arts in museums. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bonnie Efros, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Bonnie, Dr. Efros is Professor of History and Director of the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere. Bonnie.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that so many of you were able to turn out this evening. And it's my great pleasure to also welcome you to the last lecture, which is part of the Humanities Center's series called Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts. Our series will be continuing next year as well, but this is the last of the season. And we also have flyers outside the door for those of you who are interested in learning more about our series. Many of you, I recognize many familiar faces and some that are new. Our series this year has discussed various aspects of the past, present, and future place of the humanities in higher education. And tonight's presentation by Professor Anthony Shelton is particularly focused on the present and the way in which university collections can be used as catalysts for conversations that bring together the arts, the sciences, and the humanities in new ways. As we'll hear tonight, museums offer a space and also a medium by which scholars can resituate and humanize their research questions and also present their work in different ways, perhaps in some cases more accessibly to the general public. By redefining the relationship between the academy and the sciences and humanities and also with the general public, and by opening up a discourse between disparate fields of research, Professor Shelton argues that museums have the opportunity not only to change public perceptions of the humanities and science disciplines, but also to suggest new avenues of the production of knowledge. By cultivating a broader audience than available to most scholars via print or digital media, museums offer the possibility of advancing the intellectual life of society as a whole. Tonight's paper, like those that have come before it, thus contributes to the ultimate goal of our series, which is to provide a critical reading of universities' contributions to academic advances and public life, and make sense of the complex issues that are integral to the future evolution, and some might say the survival, of a liberal arts education. So I want to take a moment and thank all of our many sponsors, and we've got a slide behind me. But tonight's lecture, particularly, I want to thank the Harn Endowed Scholar Chair in Art History program of the College of Fine Arts and the Harn Museum, as well as the Rothman Endowment at the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere. And I also want to thank Sophia Akerd, Joel Parker, Chris Benura, Brenda Tucci, and Barbara Mitola for helping to prepare for tonight's lecture. As I've already noted, we've placed information on the table just outside the door for future events in the series, as well as a sign-up sheet if you'd like to get onto the center's mailing list. And we hope that you'll also join us for a reception that'll be held in the entrance gallery of the museum after the lecture and the question and answer period. So following an arduous journey to Gainesville from Vancouver, Canada, on an airline which nobody seemed to think actually existed when he flew in on Sunday night, I'm very pleased this evening to be able to introduce Professor Anthony Shelton, who's the director of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Professor Shelton earned his DPhil in Anthropology at Oxford University in 2002. He also has served previously as the head of collections, research, and development at the Horniman Museum and Gardens in London. His research interests vary widely, including theoretical foundations of anthropology, as well as the incorporation of Latin American art into Western collections. He studied the development and institutionalization of visual cultures in 19th and 20th century Yucatan, comparative ethnography of the Sierra Madre Occidental in Mexico, and he's currently preparing a project on the institutionalization of visual popular culture in mid-20th century and post-Salazar period Portugal. He's edited a number of books, including most prominently Collectors, Expressions of Self and Others, published in 2001, Collectors, Individuals and Institutions, also published in 2001, and most recently with Carol Meyer, a catalog of the permanent collections of the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia in 2009. He's also published a number of articles on a variety of topics, including combat in Mexican dance dramas, and also on museological practice in ethnographic collections. So without further ado, I'll ask that you join me in warmly welcoming Professor Shelton for his talk this evening called Rehumanizing Babel, Museums and the Re-enchantment of the Arts and Sciences.
I'd like to thank Bonnie and Sophia for inviting me here, for being wonderful hostesses. It's been a real pleasure during the last 2 days to meet so many of you and to engage in so many interesting conversations. And I can say that I'm going to go back to British Columbia with all kinds of ideas that my staff are just going to wonder where they came from and how they're going to deal with those as well as everything else that we're working on. So thank you. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about some aspects of what I call critical museology. And I'm going to explore some relationships between critical museology and, on the one hand, what I call operational museology, and particularly the relationship between a kind of a critical museology which is based on subjectivism and an operational museology which is based upon ideas of empiricism. And I'm going to kind of draw parallels between some of the ideological effects of empiricism on critical museology and on museological practices, with some of the similar effects of empiricism on the humanities. I think I will be discussing empiricism and I think some of those challenges that empiricism brings into the museum, into museum environments. I should say museums rather than art galleries. I'm going to be talking very specifically about museums. Are also shared by the humanities, and I'm going to be looking at how we might be able to reformulate museums through adopting a kind of critical museological approach to create, to form something which we call, which we might look at as a multiversity. So moving away from the university to the multiversity. I'm going to talk about the theories around the idea of a multiversity as they're being put forward by post-colonial scholars, notably Paulo Wangula and Claudio Alvarez. I'm going to then go on to say something about how we at the University of British Columbia, at the Museum of Anthropology, have attempted to use some of Alvarez's and Wangula's ideas in our new suite of galleries, which are called the Multiversity Galleries, and then go to talk about an exhibition that I don't think has really received sufficient attention in the non-Spanish speaking world. An exhibition which is in English the Potosí Principle, which was curated at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid in 2010, and to my mind which brings to the fore a lot of the problems and a lot of the promises inherent within the kind of museology that I'm going to be arguing for today. A museology that perhaps has more in common with the concerns of the humanities than does certain other types of museology. I'm going to conclude by kind of suggesting that museums become, particularly university museums, become portals into universities, and that they act as catalysts in order to create new interdisciplinarities. So I'm going to begin with looking a little bit at the relationship between what critical museology and operational museology is, since it's probably quite not so well known. For me, operational museology is that panoply of different types of knowledges, ethical interdictions, practices, codes of ethics, organizational and managerial formulations that is reproduced through professional organizations, through journals such as museums associations, and in a way deals with the nuts and bolts of how museums work. One of the things I've argued over the last 20 years is that this operational museology is not an academic subject, it is a vocational subject. And for it to appear as an academic subject, as it so often does, masks, I think, important relationships, ideological relationships within its structure. Critical museology, on the other hand, is what I believe is a kind of the study, the subject of critical museology is the study of operational museology, and the relationship between operational museology and theories of patrimony, larger exhibitionary complexes within a specific area, and public representations more generally. And this is what I teach at the University of British Columbia, is critical museology. I would argue that operational museology is dominated by a very strong empirical tradition, and this empirical tradition is inherited very much from material culture studies. Certainly in the European context, as in the 1920s, as anthropologists started to leave museums and work in universities, there was a re-institutionalization of anthropology, then many of the collections in university museums were basically left idle. And there's been problems in terms of finding a new role for those collections. Material studies, material culture studies, as they've developed, has brought in a very, very strong empirical tradition. This, I think, has in a way divided what we might call in I think Canada and European countries, which has divided a kind of an increasingly theoretically sophisticated anthropology from the study of material and visual culture, and particularly from the exhibition and the type of exhibits of that material. Empiricism is diffused from material culture studies to inform, in many cases, the purpose, the didactic methods, and the values of museums, and is one very important criteria by which museums have grown up in sharp distinction from art galleries, and also from the work of contemporary artists, that are particularly those artists associated with institutional critique. Even the public perception of museums and art galleries is, of course, very, very different, whereas various surveys carried out in Britain and also in Canada suggests that the public have a high expectation of museums as being places of knowledge, of very, very concrete forms of knowledge. This empirically defined tradition in material culture studies we find in writers such as Carol Cooper, and I'll quote from her in her definition of what an object is, and a few other definitions. She writes, firstly, inherent in any object are the raw materials of its manufacture, its form and decoration. The artifacts probably function, and the methods affected to such an end may also be suggested by physical properties. The other type of information is largely historical or anthropological, and includes where an object was made, when, for what purpose, and by whom. So these are all very, very concrete interrogations, where regardless of whether we're talking about the anthropological or the historical, or whether we're talking about the physical form and manufacture of that object. One of the things I would like to point out is that this kind of discourse suggests that Western technological discourses are neutral, and that they can be applied in understanding other systems of material culture, whereas indigenous concepts of the technologies may be phrased in very, very different ways, and that whole kind of field of indigenous expression and the understanding of indigenous technologies is something that is very, very underdeveloped. So Cooper divides material culture studies into, on the one hand, raw materials, manufacture, form around the object, and anthropological, but both still remain within a kind of within this empirical tradition, and she distinguishes that from what we might call more subjectivist modes of inquiry. For example, she goes on to write that the research into the motives of collectors is only of limited interest, and it has supplemental value only. And this is something, of course, that is intrinsic to museums. Museums are not only about remembering, they're also about forgetting. And when an object comes into a museum, the first thing it loses is its biography, its particular, the biography, the information about the collector, why it was collected, what it meant to that collector, its relationship to that collector's environment, to that collector's thought, which can be extremely, extremely important. And it's reclassified into scientific classifications. Susan Peirce, who I will mention a number of times only because she was so influential, I think, in museology worldwide, both as professor at Leicester. She was also a practitioner and president of the Museums Association for some time. So here we have the theoretization of museological practice and also its institutionalization through various professional organizations. She argues that in terms of the different forms of collecting, that museums themselves should only really concern themselves with systematic collecting. Again, emphasizing the empirical basis of museum work. Brown has made a distinction between what he calls hard material culture studies and soft material culture studies. Hard material culture studies corresponding more or less with what Cooper talks about, and soft material culture studies really apply to looking at objects as signs, but the way these signs are apprehended are signs defined as empirical, as almost kind of constructed through a natural relationship between meaning and between object. It's only with the work of Taborski, I think, where we get a more critical break between this model and an acknowledgement, this is in the 1980s, and an acknowledgement of two very distinct paradigms within museology, which are not necessarily compatible. One is what she calls the observation paradigm, which is those methods which are based upon perception, a visual perception, and the other, which would include hard and soft material culture studies, and discursive paradigms, which would look at the application, those methods which employ critical theory when looking at material culture. However, much of material culture studies also has the effect of reducing, if you like, soft material culture to hard material culture within its own terms. So, for example, relationships between signifier and signifieds are often assumed to be kind of a natural relationship. Style and intentionality of the use of an object is often reduced to function, whereas individual motives and creativity is really is ignored. And I think you find this still very, very much in museum exhibitions. It might be questioned in the academy, it might be subject to voracious critique in the academy, but still we find that it remains in some of the most important institutions worldwide as a foundation for putting exhibition work together. This kind of formalism, this kind of empirical formalism reaches its highest peak, perhaps, again with Susan Peirce, when she defines 8 properties which are common to all objects, each with its own appropriate methodology for better understanding it. Collection history, for example, is still not looked at in terms of biography or history, but in terms of a kind of a reduction to its psychological factors which stimulate it. In terms of what the relations are between these different 8 properties and how we can retotalize those relationships to get back to the original object is a problem that she really never discusses. And furthermore, the problem of using different forms of knowledge based on different epistemologies and different methodological protocols, how we can retotalize that and kind of forget the epistemology and all the ruptures in this kind of semantic universe again is never really mentioned. And I think this is absolutely true of museology, of operational museology, that museology is not one form of knowledge, but it's transdisciplinary subject which borrows from different types of knowledge and then sews those different knowledges together in what appears to be seamless, regardless of the implications intrinsic to that. So again, this time quoting from Susan Peirce, objects, she reassures us, do relate to each other in an objective sense. They do fall into groups with shared characteristics, and it is our business to use our minds so that these groupings may emerge. So intrinsic to these approaches are that material culture-based methods are the primacy of apprehension. The primary way of apprehending the world is through our sense impressions, and particularly through sight. There's also the assumption that there is a kind of a fit between how our consciousness, how our perception works, and the laws governing outside reality. And so it's almost, in an article that Levi-Strauss wrote on society, culture and ecology, he talked about the external world and the consciousness as being 2 cogs. And these cogs kind of engage each other and then turn each other according to similar principles and similar laws. And so this is a kind of an assumption at the very core of empirical methods. Empiricism is intimately associated with modernism. It involves, as we've said, giving primacy to vision. The meaning is perceived to be endemic to the thing itself. It uses a concept of induction, that given that identical conditions and procedures are pursued, that things will present themselves as they've always presented themselves and elicit a similar explanation. It encapsulates the belief in progress, the idea that these techniques of seeing and recording can be bettered, can be improved through technology and through certain techniques of engagement with that outside world. Again, stemming from this is that modernism favors a focus on the material world, things and conditions over the intangible world. Vision allows us clearer definition, classification, in a way that hearing, touch, taste, or smell all lack. There are less possibilities for objectivity. There are less possibilities for empirical conjecture using these other senses. And I would like to kind of here just move to a parallel distinction here, that distinction between tangible and intangible culture. That is also key to how a museum today defines itself. And I think this also ties back to empiricism and subjectivity. If we look at the looking at UNESCO legislation, for example, we can see that the 1972 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of World Culture, Cultural and Natural Heritage dealt specifically with the material manifestations of the of what culture was, and it was a very important instrument, which was largely backed by Western countries. And it wasn't until the late 1980s, with the emergence of non-Western pressure groups within UNESCO, that we start to move towards looking at intangible culture. And so the 1989 recommendations for safeguarding of traditional culture and folklore, the 1993 Paris Forum on the Intangible Heritage, and the 2003 International Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Culture, of the Intangible Heritage, all result not from a predominantly Western interest in the intangible, but from a movement of countries, mainly in the Southern Hemisphere, that put this forward. Now, I think there are problems with how we define culture. On the one hand, culture has been so inflated by UNESCO legislation, and particularly intangible culture, so it includes and collapses landscapes and emotions even into it, that one wonders that, you know, where does culture begin and is there anything outside of culture? Perhaps there isn't. The second problem, I think, from this, which is really a fundamental problem in my mind to what museums do, is as museums have been given the job of preserving intangible cultural heritage, and as we have seen, one way of doing this is to record that heritage, either by recording oral histories or film. What then is the relationship between what we record and the original tangible and the tangible aspects of it? How do we ever retotalize that? And I think it's a huge problem. And again, as you will kind of gather, I see fractures within this whole kind of semantic universe and within these different landscapes of museology, which really question the very basis of what we're doing in museums. I also think we should be asking questions about the nature of what this is after we've recorded it, this so-called intangible cultural heritage. Once it's recorded, what is the epistemological nature of that? Is it really the same as intangible cultural heritage, or is it something different, something completely different? Epistemologically, I think it is, in terms of its relational identity with wider spheres of activities that the original intangible cultural heritage might have been related to. It's already gone through a process of abstraction. So are we creating a third term culture? Are we in fact collecting three forms of culture, intangible, tangible, and then new digital culture? And what is the nature of that third term culture? Nevertheless, with these reservations, the UNESCO emphasis on intangible culture, I think, has had important results. It has raised questions, or certainly contributed to questions, on the exclusivity of empiricism as a system of knowledge, as a dominant system of knowledge, and I think it introduces doubt into the way, into empiricism's attempt to exclude other forms of knowledge as alternative ways of knowing the world. I think it further questions the reality effect of empiricism, although I think the rise of digital technologies perhaps actually has done more to affect this than some of these this movement to a consideration of intangible culture. The reality effect, what Bott called the reality effect of empiricism, also affects other parts of social life. It creates a naturalization of things. A naturalization, for example, of our material conditions, a naturalization of the emotions, of what is appropriate, what is normative and what is not normative, a naturalization of a culture of consumption, and a naturalization of increasing commoditization of the world. Success, in a way, in satiating this naturalized state of society is ascribed to empirical sciences and technology, and therefore any undermining of the kind of philosophical system that supports that science, which is far more than just empiricism. Science is far more than just empiricism, kind of opens up a new space, if you like, a space for the imagination and exploration of different ways of looking at the world. And I should say, I think within anthropology, there is a tradition in anthropology which really underlies a lot of what I'm saying, and that is a kind of a radical tradition. And it's inherent, I think it really starts with Clyde Kluckholm at the University of California in a book, The Mirror of Man, in which, certainly this is actually why I became an anthropologist rather than a sociologist, the idea that by looking at other cultures, you can rationalize your own culture. You don't take categories, everyday categories, as essential. You can actually create a critical distance between yourself and your own culture in order to look at the world in different and kind of and fresh work and in fresh ways. And that's certainly something, I think that's at the very, very basis of the kind of museology that I'm arguing for. Once destabilized and deprivileged, empiricism becomes just one worldview amongst others. Nevertheless, it continues to kind of exercise a strong influence on Western conceptions of the world, associated value theories and practices, including the framework of much of museology itself. And I think to exemplify this, we might kind of look at approaches to collection history. Collection history, for me, is something somewhat the opposite pole of material culture studies, and it's kind of interesting, I think, that whereas you have empirical domination of material culture studies, there are exceptions, of course. There are some very important exceptions, particularly the work that's coming from University College London and Cambridge. Collecting involves a kind of a historical approach. And it's this historical approach, which history of collecting, which depends upon subjectivities, that is left as a residue by empiricism, by material culture. Material culture cannot include, does not include, to my mind, a satisfactory description of collecting, or is capable of creating a basis for collection history. For example, Susan Peirce and Susan Stewart talk about the three typologies of collecting: fetishistic, souvenir, and systematic collections. Now, that work is well known, but turning to a work that is not so well known, a kind of a rather more popular book that was published in the 70s by Lord Eccles, a collector himself, who described 4 motivations for collections. He included prestige or embellishment being one, to furnish a house being another, profit, and fourth of personal reasons. Now, the personal reasons are rather interesting, and he includes in those the pursuit of beauty, the creation of an imaginary bond that might be felt between the collector and an artist or a maker removed in time. He also talks about, of course, the desire, the passion to complete a series, and he includes the wish to escape banality, which I think is very important. And I think if we look at some collectors, if we look at, for example, collectors like André Breton or Pablo Neruda, these are collectors in which we can key the collections to their work, to the odes of everyday things in the case of Neruda, or to surrealism in the case of Breton. And in neither case are these collections reducible to being one or a mixture of these 3 typologies. What we need is clearly a kind of a more sophisticated subjectivist approach, and the approach I would recommend is really that which has been demonstrated wonderfully by the art historian Stephen Bann in a book called Under the Sign, which looks at a 17th century collector and look at how, in order to see how a cabinet of curiosity was assembled as a means of assembling and constructing the identity, the personhood of that person himself, of creating a history, of creating an identity. And of course, material culture studies, the kind of stuff that's coming from people like Chris Pinney and Michael Rowlands and that school associated with University College, very much looks at environments and material culture not as a background, but very much as a foreground on which consciousness is created, on which it is made and remade in relationship to changing currents. So this is a kind of more textured approach, not only to material culture, but to museology, which I'm arguing. One response to the domination of empiricism, as I said at the beginning, comes from the work of 2 post-colonial theorists, the Ugandan theorist Paulo Wangula and Claude Alvarez, who's based in Goa. And the critique of empiricism is actually quite similar to what we've already talked about. They talk about universities are not universal, that universities are in fact Western institutions, and they're compromised by Western epistemes or philosophemes. They're characterized by specific classificatory logics, which we're told over and over again are in the main binary. This is something I hear from indigenous communities all the time on the northwest coast in British Columbia, but it's something that that comes from other areas as well. These epistemes, these classificatory logics, are based upon an empiricized world, which is misrecognized as and given universal truth values. For Alvarez, the multiversity has 4 basic objectives. First of all, to mount a comprehensive critique of science, to reveal its cultural foundations and refute claims of universalism. and all sciences, he claims, are ethnosciences. To conduct a critical evaluation of the assumptions underlying what he calls the humanities, but in fact what many of us would recognize as social sciences. Economics, sociology, psychology, anthropology are those that he often mentions. Third, a deconstruction of the institution of university itself, and the power relations within and between it and other institutions. And fourthly, a deconstruction of the whole of Western society. Well, this sounds rather kind of daunting and radical, but in fact we have it. It is happening. And whereas Alvarez focuses on the critique of Western knowledge institutions and discourses, Wangula is a little bit more forgiving and focuses on the importance of retrieving indigenous knowledge systems. For Wangula, the non-Western parts of the world remain epistemologically colonized. In fact, for both of these thinkers, there is this idea of epistemological colonization. This prevents economic development, and what these, according to Wangula and Alvarez, what is required in these regions are a rescue of their own epistemologies, which are particular to their own history and to their own condition, and consistent with the values and worldview contained within indigenous language. And we start to realize why language is so important, and why languages should be important in museums too. For example, in the new research infrastructure we built at UBC, the museum includes language recording studios to do work on languages. And although we've not been very successful at it, the idea was always to actually use indigenous terms to name objects and then translate into English in brackets. We say we will do this, and we've done it where possible, but there are it's very, very difficult to do, so I'm afraid there's a lot more work for us to do there. But this, Alvarez calls this program, this huge program of deconstruction, he refers to it as a kind of a reverse anthropology or a Europology. And I would just like to say that I think, in humanism we find this. We find it in the work, of course. We find it in many writers, but we find it in Foucault, in Derrida, in Barthes. We find it in the work of Marc Auger, Clyde Kluckholm, who I mentioned earlier, and Jean-Paul Vernon, Kiernan, people like Clifford and Rabineau. It is actually happening. But this is not the kind of anthropology that you often find institutionalized within anthropology departments in museum settings. It doesn't make it, or at least not in Europe, to the museums. For example, one of the largest museum projects in Europe currently is the Humboldt Forum, the creation, the moving of the ethnographic collections and the non-Western collections from the suburb of Dahlem back to the center of Berlin, a reconstruction of the old imperial palace using a kind of a pastiche, postmodernist architecture, and creating a new setting for these collections. And yet it seems almost, despite all the advisory groups that are put together on this project, it seems almost preconceived that in fact what this is going to be is a celebration of Enlightenment science and European universalism. So it's in the academy, it's in the humanities, but it's not in the museums. Now, it's not such a bleak picture in museums. I mean, there are areas. I think there's certain museums like the Ethnographic Museum in Neuchâtel in Switzerland, which was headed by Jacques Hainard, who did a whole series over 20 years of exhibitions, all of which are on the web, in which this kind of radical type of anthropology, in which you deconstruct categories, was the basis of those exhibitions. The last one being the Cannibal Museum, in which the galleries were set out with red velvet curtains and round formal tables, with gold embellished chairs and formal plate settings, and as you took a platter out of a plate, you would see an ethnographic object. So the idea here is, using metaphor, is that museums cannibalize culture, they cannibalize the meaning. And in fact, the museum had a very low budget, but there was always a paperback which was published to coincide with each exhibition, which explained the kind of philosophical concepts, conceptual concepts around these 20 or so exhibitions that Einar did before he retired. At the University of Coimbra in Portugal, again, very little known, there's a work of Nuno Porto on a number of exhibitions which he did with his students, which sought to deconstruct Western categories and Western notions, including Western notions of humanity. In the 1970s and the 1980s in Cologne, there was a work of Gisela Volker, when she was director of the Museum for Volkerkunde there, which sought to kind of deconstruct the idea of men's houses. She did 3 exhibitions. The one on men's houses really began by looking at the Rotary Club and similar clubs in Cologne, and then finished by looking at men's organizations and men's houses in New Guinea. So it was a kind of a comparative approach to the theme of men's houses. More recently, 2010, there was the exhibition Die Tropen in Berlin, which looked at the impact of the tropics on Germany and German colonial impact on the tropics. In this 2010, also the Potosí principle, which I'm going to talk about in a little while, and Moa's multiversity galleries. Now, the multiversity galleries, first of all, they try to combine what is storage space with display space to make a new type of space in which objects, the technical virtuosity, the aesthetics of objects can be appreciated. The environment, the internal environment, is what you would expect of any exhibition in any exhibition gallery, but it's a very high density type of display. So what we've tried to combine here are kind of aesthetics with storage. The areas are supposedly divided by, not by land masses, but by seas. So we've not been dealing with continents, but we've been dealing with the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, etc., the Arctic, and looking at the relationships, a more dynamic kind of way of looking at relationships between those areas, rather than dealing with land masses themselves. And thirdly, we've tried to emphasize indigenous exegesis over and above curatorial interpretation. So this is where we worked with mainly with Northwest Coast communities, but also communities in Fiji and Ghana, and on using classifications which were indigenous-based classifications. And some of these classifications might be linguistic categories, classification by makers, classification by cosmologies, or by the simple quality. For example, when we dealt with the Haida nation, the Haida said, well, that's okay. We just want to see our very, very best pieces on display. And you guys know how to do that, so just get on with it and show us the very, very best pieces. When we spoke to Kwakwala communities, where a lot of our Northwest Coast collections come from, they were very specific that they wanted a special area given to Willie Seaweed, one of the notable artists from that area. They wanted to represent the diversity of opinion within a community, so we have 3 interviews, one with a cultural broker who we deal with, we've dealt with a lot, who believes that in fact all the culture should be shared. Second, by a Kwakwala-speaking contemporary artist who sometimes combines traditional symbols and motifs in a kind of in various international styles, and one by a member of the community who believed that nothing should be shared or nothing should be shown because the culture was very specific to that community. And finally, the spirit masks they asked us to show in relationship to whether they were spirits of the sea, the air, or the land. Gustavo Bunting's writing on the possibilities of an indigenous Andean museology refers to this type of an indigenous kind of non-Western museology being basically what he calls promiscuous, or being a mestizo museology, which he sums up in the word chichi. Quechua word, which instead of emphasizing relationships of identity and similitude, looks more at expressing analogies and frictions, that are cut across different areas such as art, folk art, ethnographic objects, and so on and so forth. The museum, he argues, to be contemporary, must relinquish all its exclusivity and to any one discipline or category of objects or another. And it must combine art, craft, industrial design, what he calls found objects. Only impure, contaminated objects characterize today's society. The Potosí principle, as the exhibition that was curated in 2010, was a collaborative project between the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin and the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía in Madrid. In a way, attempted, I think, to use some of these kind of critical, non-empirical ways of looking at the world to create this exhibition that was critical of Western and particularly Hispanic history. The exhibition was intended as a critique of Hispanic commodity capitalism and the social misery during the colonial period that this brought with it to the Andes. But at the same time, it attempted to juxtapose works. Many of these works were, in fact, all of these works were usually paintings of the Cusco school or prints, 16th and 17th century prints from that area, with contemporary art in using different media. And the contemporary art was meant to make clear the relations, some of the relations, the colonial relations that were expressed in the visual, in the colonial visual languages. But also, it was intended to show that these relations continued to exist today. The design of the exhibition involved a crisscrossing of different paths, and at the intersections of these paths, there was a piling up of particular objects which related to one theme or another. Originally, the European curators worked with an Andean group of artists and intellectuals, which were referred to as El Colectivo. But differences very early on led to a split between them. The members of El Colectivo were very attached to Aymara philosophy, and a philosophy which is based on what they referred to as relationality. This relationality is defined as a continuous process of contextualization, reintegration, the reascription of meaning in both lived and imagined experiences. So you have a coming and going of what you dream, of what you imagine, with real life experiences, and the meaning that is imposed on the world is, although the forms, new symbols may come, new meanings are continually imposed one on top of another. The central category that El Colectivo dealt with was the category of Taki, which referred to roads and paths, but it could also be used to refer to a series of events through which a group of people evoke and celebrate spirits, or a succession of places or landscapes in which those spirits are associated. Taki also refers to a series of narratives or cycles of songs recited in fiestas that draw attention to the individual life cycle, and are composed of the fusion of poetry and history. European colonization created a new map of fractures and power relations, displacements and privileges, which were simply took on a different form, but which were mapped in relationship to the previous ones. Now, for the exhibition team, for the European exhibition team, Taki was used as an organizing principle for the layout of the exhibition. The exhibition was arranged like a journey, which also disclosed explicitly power relations and the story of putting the exhibition together. For example, in some Andean communities, the loan of certain paintings from churches was refused by the communities, by the brotherhoods, not by the church, but by the brotherhoods and by the councils. And the reasons for refusing these were often given that, well, maybe it might be stolen, you might not return it, or maybe you'll just send a copy back. So these explanations are included when photographs, or in one case a tracing of a work, was included in place of the original work itself. And so there is a kind of a reflexive tendency here. They were interpreted in relationship to a reversal of power relationships, where the monopoly of power was not being held by a European nation, but by a community itself, which decided whether to participate or not in this process. But there was another problem with this exhibition too, which really kind of contributed to the fallout between the artists and curators in La Paz and those in Europe. And this was a demand that there would be a fourth section to the exhibition, which included ethnography. And the argument was that the exhibition, as it stood, gave no acknowledgement to indigenous agency, that it was a critique of European power, that it showed the effect, the brutal effect of the exercise of that power and that authority, but the indigenous people were portrayed as the victims with no power to resist and as passive within that. So no agency whatsoever was given to the indigenous people. Whereas what they were arguing was that in order to kind of represent more truly what was happening and to go back to this essential Aymara philosophy around relationality, that what was required was to look at these paintings as well in relationship to the festivals in which the churches, which they are related to, as a space itself. And that it was through the festival and through the playing out of the different rituals associated with luminous beings that are depicted on these paintings as saints or as devils, and the relationship between those beings as depicted and the landscape in which they're celebrated, that was important, and which brought and which kind of which described how Aymara people and Andean people, Quechua people, had responded and domesticated some of the visual language that had been imposed on them from Europe. According to one of the members of the El Colectivo, Silvia Rivera, referred to the paintings as luminous beings and powers that can be directly traced onto the landscapes, and it was these landscapes which were precisely these landscapes which were missing from the exhibition, and which still created a kind of an absorption of an indigenous understanding, an indigenous epistemology and view of the world, and still kind of insisted on imposing a European one. Now, I still think this was a very useful exhibition because it was reflexive, it brought these issues to the fore, but most importantly, it resulted in two catalogues. One catalogue, mysteriously, which appeared in English, and I presume there was a Spanish version of it, which is the official catalogue, which is edited by the German curators, and a second catalogue which appeared in Spanish called El Principio Potosí Reverso, which actually deals with the issues that El Colectivo in La Paz actually raised. And so here you have two interpretations, two discourses which counter each other and which stem from an exhibition, but which also take book form and which raise an incredible panoply of questions around these kinds of issues. So this type of exhibit kind of positions critical museology as a reverse, if you like, of that hard museology which is based on empiricism and which rests upon hard, soft material culture studies, in which the meaning is intrinsic to the object. In fact, flies quite in the face of what Aymara and Quechua people are saying about their objects. And even though it fell back onto Western concepts of aesthetics and the division between anthropology and art historical approaches, the fractures and the alternate readings are still preserved within these two catalogues, which is immensely useful. So what does this have to do with the humanities? Well, first of all, in order to create, I think the very basis of this critical museology is founded in the humanities. In a world dominated by empiricism, it seems to me that the humanities are in a similar position to critical museology. Just as within museology, subjectivity is a residue, which is something that's left over after empiricism has done the important work of interpreting material culture, then the humanities are almost a residue which are left over after science, medicine, and economics have accomplished all the essential operations and defined the essential truths of our existence. Empiricism masquerades often as science, and it occupies a position of epistemological dominance in hard, soft material culture studies, which rejects subjectivity in the same way that it mobilizes science as if it is in an antagonistic relationship to the humanities. This, of course, is based again on visual perception. And whereas the humanities, by and large, are not determined, as critical museology is simply by visual perception. So the humanities, I think, are defined negatively as well, as a residue. And this morning I just looked at the Wikipedia definition of the humanities, which defines them as studies to provide general knowledge and intellectual skills. And then in brackets it says, rather than occupational or professional skills. That is, useful things now. Or again, they might be defined as liberal arts, which straight away tars them politically in some circles. It defines them in opposition to utilitarian or materially beneficial disciplines. And we can also look at philosophers like Stanley Fish, who suggest that the humanities can claim validity best by avoiding any connection with utility. But by avoiding that connection, then the whole force, the whole power of the humanities is diffused and lost. People like Minsky, Marvin Minsky and Joseph Carroll even argue against that whether the humanities should be publicly subsidized and advocate their replacement by technical knowledge. My contention this evening is that, if we look at this idea of multiversity, if we look at the kind of exhibitions that multiversity allows, and I take the example of the Potter's principle, then we are creating a space in which we can explore concerns that are at the very basis of our understanding of our humanity, of the very basis of our understanding of our relationship to the world around us, the relationship between the tangible and the intangible, between the material and between belief. And that these are areas in which museums can position themselves very much like the humanities also position themselves. And I want to end with a quotation from the Ohio Humanities Council, which is another definition of what the humanities are, which I can take as a definition of a program, which I think, which as a museum director, I would be very, very proud to institutionalize. The humanities are the stories, the ideas, and the words that help us make sense of our lives and our world. The humanities introduce us to people we have never met, places we have never visited, and ideas that may never have crossed our minds. By showing how others have lived and thought about life, the humanities help us decide what is important in our own lives and how we can make them better. By connecting us with other people, they point the way to answers about what is right or wrong, or what is true to our heritage and to our history. I would just like to pluralize all those rather than them to remain in the singular. But I think there are tremendous synergies between museums, and for museums to reach their potential, their real huge, enormous potential by working closely with the humanities. And I think that relationship can also kind of open new doorways into a better understanding of what science really is. So thank you very much.